Any questions? Was that a question? Oh, right there.
Well, I do want to make a comment. I just also curious as to how BRT is it. I mean, are we taking into consideration with the environmental concerns that the world has these days? Or?
It's a good example of what we are looking at. One of the criticisms about the draft environmental impact report is that under the California Environmental Quality Act, AC Transit was not required to look at the effect of the project on greenhouse gases, but gave it basically cursory attention. And the final study will look in much more detail about the impacts of the project on reducing greenhouse gases.
I just noticed you didn't mention it in the benefits that BRT has, and so I'm curious.
Well, that's, again, we're at this halfway point. We don't quite know what the it is. When we know what the it is, what the actual project is, then we can do better calculations on the effects of things like greenhouse gases and the change in traffic patterns. But if we don't know what the routes are, we don't know what the ridership is, we don't know which lanes will be closed on which blocks or not, we can't quite make those decisions. We'd all like to know today. We can't know that until the City Council gets past the next step and defines the project for a detailed study.
Yeah, I understand. It's just, it's pretty obvious that a bus system would be helpful.
Yeah. Like, I'll give you just a very small scale example. We were looking at traffic patterns on Telegraph Avenue, so we went out on the morning commute coming up Telegraph, just counted cars and the number of cars that have 1, 2, or more than 2 people in it. The number of cars was significant, but 80% of those cars had only 1 occupant. So the length of a car is, with its defensive space, is about half the length of a bus. So the amount of lane that a bus takes up is the same amount of lane that is taken up by 2 single occupancy vehicles. So a lot of the traffic issues and a lot of the impact from the emissions of single occupancy cars, you can compare with how many people are riding the bus in the same amount of lane space. That's not a scientific calculation. It makes a lot of sense just to look at that. 2 buses, 1 bus with a lot of people on it versus 2 cars with 1 person on it each. Not hard to see what's better for the environment.
That is true. Just out of curiosity, how many people can you fit into one AC transit?
Okay, so this will be the last question.
Jim, you can estimate the capacity of a 60-foot bus?
I've seen crush load, which is exactly what it sounds like. You can fit over 100 people on those buses. You can, an uncomfortable load, you can fit like 75 with a lot of standees. So the greenhouse gas emissions is, it's true that we weren't required to analyze it when we did the draft, but now there's a state law and there's local policies such as Berkeley Measure G that put more of a burden on project sponsors to do this. So there is an EPA, US EPA method for doing this. So we've, like what he called the cursory data that we had in the draft, and we've found that we can reduce carbon dioxide equivalents by 6.3 tons per day. And we're adding buses, so they're consuming fuel, and then we're reducing automobile travel, which reduces fuel. So the net comes out to be a drop of carbon dioxide, 6.3 tons per day. So it's pretty significant. I mean, it's hard to visualize what 6.3 tons of CO2 is or how it fits in the whole network. I know that the depressing fact about that is that carbon dioxide emissions for just Alameda County here is like, that's less than 0.5% of it, because there's so many millions of vehicle miles driven every day in the county. So it's small in relation to that, but as part of, if you want to compare to like Berkeley's climate action plan, it's roughly 1/3. The whole project's roughly 1/3 of Berkeley's whole climate plan carbon reduction. So it's significant as a step towards reducing that.
I can give you another visual image. If you take CO2 and use it to inflate a 32-gallon garbage bag, that's about 1 pound of CO2. So 6 tons of CO2 is 12,000 garbage bags full of CO2 every day.
The emissions of CO2 are 140 million tons of CO2 per day in the Bay Area. It's just over the top. And the other thing, if I could mention one thing which I think is relevant, comparing the BRT in Curitiba to what's being done here is not exactly right, but in Curitiba, the FTA, the Federal Transportation Authority, did a study that showed they reduced the per capita gasoline consumption by 20%, which is a really significant drop in energy use and CO2 emissions. The presumption was we built a full-scale BRT system in the Bay Area, perhaps we could get that kind of reduction. I just think that's what we need.
Thank you so much, Alan. So I'd just like to also encourage the public, if you have comments, we did pretty extensively agree on equal time for each speaker. And so we would encourage questions to be personally, because we will have an opportunity right after this to have a forum and actually engage in dialogue about this. So